Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. You're all very welcome to this, which is our second set of webinars in the GDI Expert Series. My name is Fiona Farrell and I'm the CGIAR System Senior Advisor on Gender, Diversity and Inclusion in CGIAR's workplaces, which I have to admit is a bit of a mouthful. And so to make it easier for everyone around here, we shorten it, we just say GDI. It's great that you can join us today. You know, as usual, this webinar has been held twice. So this is the second delivery of this webinar. In GDI, we do this deliberately so that we can reach the most amount of people in real time. I'm very happy to share that we've quite a lot of people registered for today's discussion from across the system. We had almost 100 people with us yesterday, so let's see how many we can get today. While we're waiting for the last few people to join us, let me give you a quick introduction to GDI for those of you who are joining us for the first time in this webinar series. As many of you may be aware, in late January this year, CGIAR, we reaffirmed our shared commitment to advancing gender equality, diversity and inclusion in our global workplaces by adopting a new framework, a new GDI framework and action plan. Now, since late January, we've been hard at work supporting HR directors and a new cross-system GDI network and collaborating on a whole range of new and exciting GDI activities. A critical part of my job is to support knowledge sharing and to build GDI capacity. So over the coming months and years, we'll be sharing guides and resources and training and a whole bunch of other support, including running webinars like this one on a variety of relevant GDI topics. So as we're still waiting for some more folks to join us, let's talk practicalities. Please feel free to use your camera or not, as you choose, depending how you're feeling. Whatever time it is there, wherever you're joining us, may dictate whether or not you want to share your camera. But do take a moment to say hi on the chat box on the right-hand side. Say who you are and where you're joining us from. Not everybody may know everybody on the webinar today. Remember that you can use the chat box if you like to add your comments, thoughts and questions throughout today's session. It's a great moment for me to introduce and sincerely thank Helen Juice. Thank you, Helen, who's ably facilitating once again all the technology for us. Helen's going to be keeping a close eye on the group chat and bringing up points as you raise them throughout today's session. Now, please remember that if when you're using the chat box, you would like to keep your comments private, you wouldn't like to share your questions with everybody, you can actually communicate with Helen directly using the private chat function of the Zoom group chat. And that will make sure that your comment remains private between you and Helen, and she can bring your comments up to the group. So as more people are joining us, let's take a look at what the format is for our 90-minute session today. We're going to start, as we have done in the past, with some brief thoughts on today's subject. Then we'll do a little poll to hear how everyone is feeling right now. Then we'll go straight to our expert panelists who are joining us today. In between hearing from them, I'll take the opportunity to share what the GDI function is doing on anti-racism to support centres and alliances, and then we'll open up for a nice long Q&A session where we look forward to hearing your thoughts and your questions via the chat box. At the end of the session, as usual, we'll have a short survey so that you can tell us how you found today's session, and as always, we'll be very grateful for all your suggestions. So now we got all those practicalities out of the way, let's get down to it. What are we talking about today? Well, today we've chosen to start some very courageous conversations, as Glenn Singleton calls them. We want to talk about the important and often very emotionally challenging subject of racial discrimination in the workplace. Before we jump straight in, let's do a very quick poll to see how everyone is feeling. Helen, put the poll up for us there. Hopefully, what you're going to see on your screen right now is a poll that's asking you how you're feeling. How are you currently feeling about the movement against systemic racism worldwide. We're being tough with you in this webinar. We're asking you only for your strongest feeling. Are you feeling indifferent? Are you feeling frustrated that this has taken so long to emerge? Are you amazed by the awakening worldwide? Or are you feeling personally committed or energized to fight racism in the workplace? Have a think and then a quick click.
So I'm just waiting. We've got about 46. Oh, okay, fantastic. We're getting a little bit further. We've got nearly 70% of people are voting. So a few more moments. Okay, we've got about 84%. So let's just see.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. If I look at the poll results that are popping up, pretty similar to yesterday. A large number of people committed and amazed, but equally some people feeling a little bit frustrated that this has taken so long to emerge, and some people really not very sure, how this is affecting them, or feeling a little bit indifferent. If you're like me, I suspect there might be a number of us who would have liked to have ticked more than one box on that one. But I think the majority of us have been affected in one way or another by not only the brutal death of Mr. George Floyd and the deaths before him and since, but also the widespread condemnations of racism and social injustice that have been triggered over the many weeks. Many of us have been forced to sit back and reflect very deeply and to take stock of our own attitudes and our actions. And at this particular time, when people around the world are bringing the issue of racism and social injustice into a very sharp attention, you will have seen that CGIAR has made a very clear statement condemning and rejecting racism. And it's important. It's important that all staff and partners and the world in general know what we as a mission-driven organisation stand for, and importantly, what we stand against as well. Now, our new CGIAR framework for gender diversity and inclusion that I referred to earlier, it makes an unequivocal statement to a diverse and inclusive workplace for everyone. But we have to stop there and recognise that it's not just enough to make simple high-level statements. Important as they are, words are not enough. And as mission-driven organisations, we can't be engaged in tokenism. The important moment that this is requires us to look at our own workplaces and see what we can do better. So put simply, this is an important moment for reflection, and following reflection, informed and meaningful action. Now, in choosing anti-racism as a subject for this webinar, we openly acknowledge that for many people, this subject is potentially very difficult to speak about. It's very emotional, it's very deeply felt, and I know for some people joining today, the tragic events and what they represent in many societies around the world may have affected you in many different ways. They may have triggered strong emotions, and unfortunately, they may have even resurfaced memories of past traumas. If this is the case for you, please know that confidential counselling is available for you, should you wish to access it. Go to cgiar.org. At the very bottom of the GDI webpage, you will find standard operation procedures for accessing the confidential counselling. It's open to all CGIAR staff in a range of languages at no personal cost to you. This counselling support is obviously in addition to whatever support is available at your centre or alliance. As we begin today's webinar and our conversations on racism and discrimination, I think it is very important for me, as a person who identifies as a white woman, to clearly state that an understanding of the concept of white privilege is a really important step in being anti-racist. And in saying that, I equally acknowledge that few of us have arrived to this point in our life without having had to overcome some form of hardship. For our colleagues joining us today, who like me, do not identify as a person of colour, our discussions in no way undervalue your personal struggles, whatever they may have been. But today, we are deliberately taking time to very clearly recognise that racism is an unacceptable, distressing, deeply personal lived issue for many of our colleagues around the world. And as such, it is important to make the space for this important ongoing dialogue, with this webinar being just the starting point on a longer journey. We know this isn't always an easy conversation to have, and if you're coming to today's webinar hoping we have all the answers, then let me tell you straight off, we don't. We don't have all the answers, but we are approaching this subject today from a place of humility and sensitivity, and we're in search of guidance from those who are willing to share. As I said earlier, this is the start of an important conversation. We'd like to continue it. As a final note of caution, if you have been personally affected by racism in the workplace and you would like to confidentially speak to someone about it, then this webinar is not the space in which you should do so. Your centre or alliance has a concern raising process in place, and I strongly encourage you to seek that out and use those safe spaces that have been provided for you. If you're not sure what those confidential channels are and you'd like to reach out to your HR team member, I'm sure that they can give you directions to those safe spaces. Okay, looks like we've got a nice bunch of people with us now. Our goal for today is to benefit from the insights of 3 experts on racial equality as they share perspectives and their lessons learned on combating racial discrimination in the workplace. As part of that discussion, we'll highlight the actions being undertaken by CGIAR's GDI function as we go through. So let me introduce our panelists today. First, I'd like to introduce Maria Hutchinson. Maria is a management consultant, hi Maria, and certified coach who's worked with international and intergovernmental organizations for over 30 years. Her UN service includes senior positions with UNHCR, IOM and UNOG. A UK national with Caribbean parents, Maria has delivered programs in Europe, Asia, Eastern and Southern Africa, and the Americas. Thanks for being with us today, Maria, and you're very welcome. Let me move then to Joel. Next is Joel Brown. Joel is the Chief Visionary Officer at Numos, a management consulting and coaching company based in San Francisco. His clients have spanned the for-profit and mission-driven sectors, and his focus areas include anti-racism, men's leadership, LGBT inclusion, and intercultural communication, among others. Joel's a member of several international think tanks, which includes D2K, the Diversity Collegium, and the Global Community Dialogue. Thanks so much for joining us today, Joel, and you're very welcome. Now, we should have Nini with us. Helen, has Nini managed to get connected?
I don't see her in our participant list unless she's joined under somebody else's name.
Right. Well, yesterday we had Nini with us, which was great. And I'm hoping that Nini will be getting connected pretty soon. In the meanwhile, what we will do is we will get started and we'll hopefully make that connection with Nini pretty soon. Let me turn directly to Maria. Maria, you've worked in the UN for many years. There's often the perception, that we in mission-driven organizations, we should just be better at this. We're already multicultural, we're multicolor, we're based all over the world, and our values are grounded in making the world a better place. Surely we should have this sorted already. What has been your experience in terms of awareness and understanding of the problem of workplace racial discrimination in mission-driven organizations? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Fiona, and greetings to all the colleagues out there. It's really a pleasure to be with you all and to join this important conversation. Okay, so Fiona, I think partly the problem that we're facing in our multilateral international organizations is just that we are all, I think, here because we believe in trying to improve the world and make a contribution to peace and security, human rights, global development, whatever aspect may be our passion. And I think it's because of this that we find it hard to take a step back and actually accept that we individually ourselves may be racist. And we know we all have bias and prejudice, but it's really hard to confront it. And I think this lack of perhaps self-awareness and this lack of commitment to actually explore what's going on inside our respective organizations and where we may be even unknowingly or unconsciously contributing to systemic racism. I think this block is what's held us back from dealing with it. So I think the fact that now we're awakened by this global wave of awareness out there, and the fact that people no longer will accept racism is terribly important for us now. We have to also, I think, bear in mind that the UN system is highly hierarchical and we have a lot of power dynamics. And I think that's what might make it difficult also for individuals to raise their hand and say, that was a racist statement, or I feel I have been the subject of racism, or this system seems to be racist against certain groups of people. What happens also, I think, is because we are well-meaning overall, we tend to reject that and think, no, we couldn't possibly be doing this on purpose, or so-and-so didn't mean what you thought they were saying when they made that statement. You're being oversensitive, or don't be so aggressive. So I think we also get defensive often about it and almost blame the victim of racism, those who are suffering racism. So we have a lot of work to do to, I think, explore and investigate inside and change this. I was heartened to see, as probably many people have, that the UN Secretary General recently made a statement acknowledging that not only do we have to continue the work to obliterate the scourge of racism outside, but he also acknowledged the fact that if racism is everywhere, it means racism is internally in us, in all of our UN entities, all of our multilateral entities. So we have to take that time to explore, to listen, learn, investigate, and work toward stamping it out. Not easy, but I think the time is right. And I think what you're doing here, for example, is a great step forward, and I hope many other organizations will do the same in confronting it, accepting it, and moving on to get rid of it.
Thanks very much, Maria. Thank you. I mean, I'm picking up on one of the points that you've said there, you know, about confronting it and accepting it and dealing with it. And I'd like to go straight to Joel. I mean, we know that the opposite of racist isn't not racist. It's anti-racist. And that's an important distinction, because being anti-racist involves acknowledging and confronting racial inequality wherever we see it, including in our workplaces, as Maria said. You know, that means encouraging and engaging in discussion and listening carefully, even when it's uncomfortable. For individuals like myself who don't identify as people of color, there can be an awkwardness and a real personal discomfort, or even for some people, fear about engaging in such conversations. You know, like a fear of inadvertently getting it wrong, or being offensive, or even, you know, I mean, being perceived as inauthentic or performance allyship, you know, just basically not being believed as being sincere. And also, I'm aware that for some people of colour for whom racism is a real lived, distressing experience, which is affecting them and perhaps their families as well. Being approached for unsolicited and uninformed conversation at the water cooler, you know, or at the end of a meeting about racism can be deeply personal and difficult, because not everybody wants to talk about injustice, especially injustice they have personally experienced. Some colleagues of colour over the past weeks have confidentially shared with me that they're just feeling a little emotionally burnt out right now. So for our HR directors and our people leaders who want to be actively anti-racist, who want to initiate that important dialogue in their workplace. Where do we start, Joel?
Where do we start? Isn't that a good question? So first, I want to thank CGIAR for the invitation. Thank you, Fiona. Thank you, Helen, for your work. I think that question requires a two-part answer. So I'm going to start with the organizational space, and then I'm going to come back to the individual. For the organization, I think the first question is to ask yourself, why do you want to have this conversation now? And what has prevented you from having the conversation in the past? Because these experiences have been there for quite some time. So I think it's first to understand what's your objective and how are you going to frame this? Because it can't just be a conversation for conversation's sake. Hopefully it's tied to a larger initiative related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. What I would say as the individual leader, or just as an individual within any organization, it's really important to make sure that number one, you understand that the human element of having these conversations. And so what do I mean by that? Just having the recognition, the ability that when you're talking about these things, you don't necessarily have to be academic or intellectual. You can simply say, if you're talking to a colleague, how are you? Or you can express empathy by saying, I'm sorry that this has happened. How can I support you? That way you're receiving information from the other person and they can guide you and instruct you on how you can show support for them. One of the things I teach in France, I teach an MBA course on empathy. It's called story listening. And one of the things that I think many people misunderstand is empathy. They see empathy as the sameness of experience. So they may say that I have to be from a certain part of the world, or I have to be of a certain nationality or of a certain cultural background in order to understand. And empathy is not requiring you to have the same lived experience. It's asking you and inviting you to tap into the core emotion of your particular human experience. And so if you know that people around the world, and it's not just a US problem, I hope people are aware of that, but if you see people who are being targeted and brutalized based on the color of their skin, based on their cultural background, perhaps you can look into your own experience and think about times when you may have seen or witnessed similar things based on your diversity identity, and how would you feel? And how would you want people to connect with you? That's empathy. And so understanding that empathy is going to be important is also necessary to establish safe space for people to make sure that they feel safe in sharing their stories, because sharing a story is a gift. It is not an obligation, it's not a requirement. And making sure too that as you center the needs of people of color in these conversations, also making sure that people understand that they don't have to do, that people of color understand that they don't have to do the emotional labor. So if they don't want to share, then they don't have to share, because a lot of the conversation around anti-racism is not just for people of color to talk about their experiences, but also for white people to understand their obligation and their responsibility to create more anti-racism and to do the work. So people of color should not be the emotional avatars for the organization. We want to make sure that we're creating this space for them to express and to share should they decide to, but also making sure that everybody in the organization recognizes that they have to be a leader in order to create an environment of inclusion. So I'll stop there, but it's really two parts, the organization and the individual.
Thanks very much, Joel. I think that Nini is still having difficulty connecting, so I'm going to actually come right back to you, Joel, because I heard you say during that that lovely response that there's something there around asking questions and listening and making sure that channels are available for that dialogue to happen. So we know it is important to create those, productive and respectful spaces, those safe spaces where staff can feel comfortable talking about racial issues, should they wish to. And also, we have to take on board the power dynamics which can be at play. So just assuming that those channels exist and that they're going to be comfortable for everybody to use is probably not a good assumption. So now you've worked in a whole bunch of organizations to support them in transitioning, to create those safe spaces. There's some lovely phrases: giving voice, creating safe spaces, speak up culture. What does that actually look like, in real life? If you're a manager, how do you go about creating those safe spaces?
Well, I think the first part is always education. And so number one, educating yourself about the experiences of people of color all around the world, and whatever group you're focusing on. So, and not making it the responsibility of other people to teach you, but also taking it as your responsibility as a leader and as a global citizen to educate yourself about the experiences of people of color. And then also recognizing that there will be times where people of color need to have their own space to process and to share experiences on their own. Now, I've seen in different situations, I was at a conference, for example, last year in Prague, where the people of color wanted to meet separately to talk about their experiences within the organization itself. And people said it was being divisive. And I think what people have to recognize is that there's safety, there are things, there's a reason why these concerns have not been voiced before, because people don't feel like they're going to be listened to, or they feel like they might be retaliated against. So safe space means that you are honoring the stories of those who are there and giving them the space on their terms to do so, where they can be completely authentic, they can be completely open, and they're not, and the sensibilities and the needs of the people of color are first and foremost. And so they're not there to placate or to support or to appease other people. That's what I would say. So when we say give voice, give an opportunity for people to use their own language and to speak to their own experiences without concern for masking or covering, where you hide who you are in order to feel safe within the workplace. And so it's really important to do that. And sometimes when I've seen dialogues, they want to bring everybody together initially. And I would actually say, at the initial stages, allow people of color to meet first privately, and then when ready and when the work has been done also with allies or people who are non-Black or people who are non-POC, then bringing the group together to do the work, but making sure that you have allowed the people of color to attend to their own needs and the non-people of color to understand how to be empathetic, how to be allies, and how to hold space where it's going to be focused on people of color primarily.
Great. Thank you so much. Let's do another poll. Let's do another poll. Helen, would you like to put the poll up for us? Hopefully what you're seeing on your screen right now is a question that's asking you how you feel about your centre or alliance's response to combating racism. Now, this is not about naming centres or alliances. That's not the point of this question. This is really about taking the pulse about how do you feel right now? Do you feel that you're a little dissatisfied, that maybe too little is being done? Do you feel somewhat suspicious that words might not translate into action? Are you somewhat surprised and pleased by your centre's alliance response? Or are you delighted that your centre or alliance is not just talking about it, but moving to action? Let's see how we feel about that right now. You can click away. And while you're clicking, let me just take the opportunity to share with you that Helen is, as usual, doing a marvelous job of listening very carefully to what everyone is saying. And if you look at the Zoom group chat on the right-hand side, she's got lots of summary points that are coming up from the questions, which is available to everybody, which we will keep in the recording and for future use. But just to make sure we don't miss anything, it's all there in bullet points and little paragraphs on the right-hand side.
Okay, we've got about 80% of people voted, so I shall share the results now.
All right, okay. Now, this is slightly different to yesterday in some ways. About the same, about dissatisfaction. People in this webinar are a little bit less suspicious. There was a little bit more suspicion yesterday. But I will say that, you know, it's about the same in terms of a distribution between somewhat suspicious, somewhat surprised and delighted. And again, you know, I think if anyone out there is thinking like me, I think some of us might have wanted to tick more than one box off of that poll. But it looks like a number of us are agreeing that we do have an opportunity to be a little bit more focused on the issue of anti-racism in our workplace, recognizing that one size doesn't fit all, and local contexts are different depending which duty station, which environment we're working in. Let me take this opportunity just to share a very high-level summary of the immediate actions that the GDI function has been taking and will be taking over the coming weeks and months to support centres and alliances on anti-racism. If you wouldn't mind putting the slide up there for me, please, Helen. Hopefully, what you're starting to see on your screen right now is a one-page summary which outlines the 10-point plan. How are we doing? Is that coming up there?
Sorry, just 1 second. I'm just having trouble locating it. Hang on.
No problem. While Helen is putting that up, let me take you through the first point of the 10-point plan. The first point is really around making sure that we practice duty of care, you know, that we take care to provide the confidential counselling that I mentioned earlier through the GDI function. For those,
can you see that now, Fiona? Is that there now?
Not yet, no, we're seeing something else. We're seeing your Zoom screen. Technology is not being kind to us today. As I was saying, continue to provide the confidential counselling that I mentioned earlier through the GDI function for those that do wish to access it. There we go, well done, thank you. You may remember, if we look at the screen on the left-hand side, that this counselling was originally set up to support staff with the challenges of COVID-19, but it is pretty clear that in this important moment, providing continued access to this counselling, in addition to whatever else is being provided through your centre and alliance, may be beneficial for some staff. The second thing is really around honouring what both Maria and Joel and when Nini was with us yesterday as well, to honour the point that we're continually hearing the importance of providing safe spaces for authentic inputs. So what we're going to do is we're creating a new cross-system GDI consultation group comprised of volunteer colleagues of colour that we will turn to for guidance. So we do need formal spaces where we can get authentic perspectives on the guidelines, the tools, the training that we're developing, as well as future shared approaches to policy and people practice. And this consultation group will be solely for the purpose of giving ideas and perspectives. And pretty soon, in the next week or so, you'll see a call going out for volunteers to join that group. The third point is around making sure that we have a much larger employee-led resource group. You'll see the acronym there, an ERG, that will work with the support of the GDI function to create an inclusive environment for all colleagues of colour and those other diversity dimensions who wish to join them. So the concept of an ERG is basically an affinity group, as Joel was highlighting earlier, to create a space where people who have things in common, who identify with shared experiences, can get together to offer learning opportunities, networking, support, cultural events, social gatherings, whatever that group feel is important for them at their space in their time. It's not going to be a silo, but much an inclusive group. And the idea is not to isolate colleagues, but rather to make sure that they have the space in order to think through and discuss and create support for one another. It's also important to remember that in creating ERGs for colleagues of colour, we're not asking them to come up with anti-racism initiatives, but it's really around getting interested people together. So that call to join the coordination committee to get that off the ground will go out next week as well. Now, we're going to extend these concepts in 2 and 3 beyond colleagues of colour. So you'll see over the next couple of weeks that we're also going to launch an employee-led resource group on women in research and science. We're also going to launch one on wellness. So this is the start of a much bigger series of creating cross spaces for voice and support. Okay, flying through the rest. The fourth one is really around continuing to use platforms like our webinars to hear from recognised experts. This will not be our only opportunity to talk on this subject. The fifth one is that you'll see we're creating a GDI toolkit for our HR professionals and people leaders so that they can get a little bit more comfortable dealing with topics of inclusion. And this week we'll be pilot testing the first new CGIAR e-learning course on gender diversity and inclusion. That one is going out really to provide an introduction to GDI, and both of those tools and all other toolkits will have a very firm set of anti-racism themes embedded into them. Point number 6 is that we're currently developing a panel pledge campaign. Now, those of you who know about panel pledges will know that it's really around encouraging staff to stop and think before they agree to speak in a conference or take part in a panel. And traditionally, panel pledges have been just around considering gender diversity. But now we're also going to enlarge that a little bit and ask staff to also consider racial diversity before they make commitments as well. Number 7, we recognise that not all managers are comfortable managing racially diverse workforces. There is a need to support managers and to make short workshop sessions available to help senior leaders engage with active listening. We know that that's an important component for combating discrimination. Point number 8, we also know that a key way to support the shifting of norms is to recognise achievement. So we're also exploring how to set up a bunch of award categories to recognise and celebrate those people who are really taking a lot of action in their workplace in this area. 9 and 10 are really about walking our own talk, making sure that the new GDI network actively pursues racial diversity in all that we do, and further consulting on all of these 10 items and adjusting as necessary based on the feedback. We know one size doesn't fit all, and like all inequalities, we've got a lot of complexity to deal with. So for us, it's about making sure everything we do while we're thinking global, that we're creating support for people to act locally. I'd like to acknowledge and really sincerely thank all those colleagues of colour who informally worked with us to come up with these first steps. And we're looking forward to refining them even further over the coming weeks with the new consultation group. So we're really delivering, practical actions. One of the things you'll have seen in these 10 items is the need to continue to benefit from experts. So I'm going to go straight back to Maria now and ask a very practical question. Maria, you will have seen the need, for us to really help support awareness raising on how people can be actively anti-racist, talking about training. What lessons have you learned around developing and implementing effective training on anti-discrimination and workplace equality?
Thanks, Fiona. Well, I have to honestly say that whilst we've done, I think in my experience and from what I've seen in organizations around the system, a lot of good work on basic diversity training. I don't think that we have done nearly enough clearly on racism per se. But I think the good news there is that we have, I think, many tools and many approaches that can be adapted and can focus specifically on racism and anti-racism. I think it's not a huge step to do that. I also think there's so much expertise out there. For example, Joel, and yesterday we had Nini, and there are many who have real expertise in training in this area that we can bring in to support our efforts. I would say that it's really important not only to raise that awareness through training, self-awareness, and maybe even to, open our eyes through assessments that we can do, not that have to be shared with everybody, but there are a lot of good tools there that identify our bias through computer programs and all that really will give us, for example, our level of bias in different areas, which, as I said before, we all have. But then what do we do with that knowledge? Now that we know it, what do we do with how to avoid it, how to overcome it, And I think that's where, and I was pleased to see that you're doing some e-learning with senior managers, but that you're going to supplement that with discussion groups, because I think the awareness raising and the training has to go through across the whole system, obviously. So, and whilst it might be difficult for senior managers to firstly, embrace this, it's critical. So I would say, we have to make sure that everyone's participating. As Joel had said earlier, we have to give people safe spaces to discuss it, learn from it, and then decide, what are we going to do with this knowledge now? Where do we apply it? And where is maybe special awareness raising and training necessary? For example, one of the obvious ones might be in terms of recruitment panels and interview panels in particular. Are there approaches that we're using in our process today that are racist? Even though we may not be acutely aware of it right now, we need to examine it and see. And then that training will help us to improve those situations. So I think the other point about training and awareness raising is, the training in and of itself is not useful if we don't hold people accountable. So how do we hold people accountable? How do we know what we've achieved and if we're moving in the right direction? And for that, I think, we've learned some lessons from, I think, training in gender equity, etc. We have a lot of ways of taking a pulse of this, reporting annually, what progress are we making, so that when we say we want to spend resources and time on how to overcome racism in our organization, we really mean it, and we're going to measure it. And there are many ways of doing that, so I don't think it's at all beyond our capacity. But again, we have to show that we mean business, and that the training isn't just for the sake of the training. So there are many other things I could bring, but I think that's maybe one of the key issues that I'd like to raise there.
Thanks so much, Maria. We're missing Nini's perspectives today, which she very she brilliantly brought to our conversation yesterday, really around looking at the challenge of discrimination, racial discrimination in particular, from the African continent perspective. I'd like to give that challenge to you, Joel, around recognizing what we said earlier, that one size won't fit all in terms of a solution, and that the types of challenges some of our colleagues may have in some parts of the world may be extraordinarily different to some of the challenges that are being experienced in other parts of the world, whether that's to do with legal issues or whether that's to do with historical issues, and everything combined all up together. What are multinational organizations doing right now? Organizations like us that are really, working around the world in different environments, facing different challenges. What are they doing to make sure their responses are truly impactful?
Well, I think the first thing that they have to do is to ensure that their actions are not just symbolic. So we have a really important inflection point right now where the world we seem to have the world's attention. And the question I ask of leaders is, now what are you going to do with it? What are you going to do that you have this focus and that you have this opportunity? So I think we have to make sure that actions are not symbolic. And we have to make sure that as we frame DI initiatives, that it's done in the context of business, the goals and the values of the organization. Even in 2020, I at times will hear organizations say or treat DEI as an add-on, as though it somehow doesn't improve the bottom line, or somehow it's not tied to business performance, or somehow it's not something that is important for achieving the mission of the business. And I would say to those leaders, if at this point you still have questions about the ability of DEI to improve performance and to generate high-performing teams and to improve productivity and to help to create a culture of inclusion, then you're being willfully blind, because the statistics are out there, the data is out there. I would also say too, it's really important to make sure that as we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, that we don't have a kind of a monochromatic perspective, or that we're not looking at this from a monocultural perspective, because the issues that we perhaps may see here in the United States or North America are going to be different in Western Europe, are going to be different in Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, and obviously in Africa as well. And so it's important to make sure that you have an intercultural lens as well, and to recognize that ethnic and racial issues may be framed differently, may not necessarily be discussed as racial or ethnic issues. Even the term people of color is something that not only I know is debated here in the United States, but also may not be applicable to other parts of the world. So it's important to have that lens as well, and to make sure that you have a global perspective when you're thinking about these things. And then as you do that, to make sure that your response is comprehensive. And so a lot of times companies employ what I call a diversity immature perspective, where they're focused on just getting people in the door. But then once people are in the door, they don't do much to make sure they stay in the organization. So your perspective and your strategic plan around diversity, equity, inclusion has to go beyond recruitment and retention, but must ensure that the person and the employee and the staff person feel supported and nurtured in the working relationship for the tenure of their career. And that would include a number of things related to communications, to benefits, to leadership development, whether you have a leadership pipeline, whether there's mentoring opportunities, how are you engaging with the community? So it requires a broad-based perspective, and it requires courage, and it requires the understanding that this is not going to be easy work. And so many times organizations get inspired, and at the first sign of, I would say, difficulty, or when they first realize that perhaps they didn't know as much as they thought they did, then they withdraw, or they retreat, or they become disillusioned. And you have to understand that in doing this work, you have to unlearn what you've learned, and you have to be comfortable with the uncomfortable. If you do that, I think you'll be better than most of your peers in the industry. If you don't, then your diversity and equity initiative will probably be short-lived and ill-fated, because you've not taken the time to realize that you have to do the work. You have to recognize that you do the right research. And when I say research, it doesn't mean that you have to take weeks or months, but making sure that you understand the issues, and that you've also illuminated the voices of those who are going to be impacted, and use their cultural expertise to think about how you can create a more inclusive environment. So it requires a strategic approach, it requires courage, and it requires having a global perspective if you really want to do this well, and understanding that there will be some adaptability that you will have to maintain, because you may try something, you may have to adjust and constantly assess, and not to be afraid of that. And I think there's also this mentality too, that you try it once, if it doesn't work, then everything has failed. And it takes constant commitment and adaptability and flexibility. We live in a VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And you have to continue to remember that, particularly with your DEI initiatives.
Thank you so much. I'd love to open it up for questions now. I know that some people have already been contacting Helen, but if you want to put some questions either through Helen privately or up on the group chat, I'm going to keep Maria busy with a question while you're busy getting your questions ready. Maria, I'm going to ask you another very direct question. Mm-hmm. All of the great things that Joel has just suggested to combating, workplace inequity is a journey that starts with a single step, right? Mm-hmm. So we got to start somewhere. We've got to start it, and we've got to continue that journey. But on any journey, there's always the possibility, as Joel said, that some things don't work, mm-hmm. or we have some missteps. We make some mistakes along the way. Mm-hmm. We've spoken about some of the things we should be doing. What should we be avoiding? What are the things that you've seen other organizations doing that, although very well intentioned and well meaning, simply just don't work?
Well, I mean, Joel has talked so clearly about many things that are required and that we have to do. I think one of the things we shouldn't do is think it's going to be, and this is really the flip side of what he said, it's not going to be a quick fix. Okay, so let's go in for the long haul with commitment. Let's take it with momentum and step by step, but at the same time, let's not rush through it. Let's do it properly. because we change, as we've been saying, is painful and it takes time. So let's have commitment, I would say momentum, but let's not snowball people, rush over people and lose them through frustration, fear, or whatever. We have to be so careful when we're dealing with very emotional issues, as we've said. I would say let's be sure that we, and I've mentioned this, that we don't miss anyone across the ranks. You know, we have to start and include the top, but we have to include everybody who's a part of the organization, and that can be staff who are junior. It may be consultants and people who have been working with the organization but actually are not staff, but because they're impacted by all this as well, and they have a story to tell. So I would say don't miss anybody out. Don't be too afraid of if we make a mistake, acknowledge it and move on, in other words. Have the courage to go and try things, pilot them even, and if they don't work, try something else. I would say, take another direction. Don't think we have to invent the wheel. There's so much out there. Look at what worked in other places and see how it can be adapted to our environments in different parts of the international system. I would say also, Joel mentioned, when working particularly with private organizations and corporations, they're looking at the bottom line. Let's not, I think, forget that what we do inside should have a really powerful effect and impact on what we do outside. And I'm sure we'll be talking about resources, but there was a really interesting, a short but powerful article recently in The Guardian newspaper in the UK, which I'm sure we can share, in the resources, about systemic racism in the aid community. And how we have to approach that. So if we have the courage to look inside, it may really help us improve our impact in the world outside, which is what we're all about anyway. So let's link it also to our bottom line in the nonprofit area. I think don't overload people at once. I think people need resources. And they want to have discussions, but again, I think pace it and don't make people feel overwhelmed. All easier said than done, but I think those are some of the lessons from similar approaches and other difficult and sensitive areas. And I would say again, I think if we can help people see progress and measure it, don't forget about that, the possibility of measuring, getting impact and monitoring as we go along, because I think it gives people confidence and enthusiasm to take the next step if we see we're getting somewhere and we've made an impact. So just a few thoughts on that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Maria. Let me pick up on two things there. Resources. Just so everybody on the call is aware, we discussed this yesterday in a little bit more depth, but I'd like to bring it up again today. One of the key deliverables for us as a GDI function in the next couple of months is launching a new knowledge hub. And this knowledge hub will basically be simply that, a space where we will have a whole bunch of resources related to the various elements of work that we're focusing on in the GDI function. One of them will be on anti-racism, and it will have a whole bunch of readings, training courses, links to YouTube videos, links to webinars. So in other words, it'll be a great space where you can dip in and out of when you come across issues that you don't understand or areas that you'd like to strengthen. So making those resources available to you in bite-sized chunks, as well as 90-minute webinars, we know is very important. The other thing that we spoke a lot about yesterday with Mimi was, the importance of measuring and monitoring success, and we talked about the importance of including measurement on racism and workplace equality into not only pulse surveys but workforce surveys, and I'm really happy to share that work is underway on that as well, that we need to find ways to be able to check how people are feeling, how people are perceiving the workplace in terms of anti-racism. Okay, Helen, do you have any good questions for us?
So at the moment, no, people have been very shy. I've got a few that we didn't get to yesterday, so I thought we could throw some of those in the mix if you're up to it.
I mean, this is unusual. We're a very small, cozy group. Yesterday we were very large. So we're going to take advantage of being a much smaller, cozier group today. So you can raise whatever questions you like. But Helen, yes, please bring one from yesterday if we have.
So one from yesterday that I thought was very interesting was about the sort of quick wins. So this sense of when we're listening to these fantastic suggestions and this understanding that it needs to be really holistic and comprehensive and strategic, it can feel a little overwhelming and that this is just going to take so long. And so any suggestions on what are the things that we can do now that we can get on with straight away, recognizing that we don't rush so much that we miss doing it properly, but are the things that we can just start now to have that will have an impact?
I can take that one, and I'm sure Maria has something to share as well. There are a number of different things. It just depends on, I mean, first of all, having the conversation. I don't want to make light of that having the conversation right now is such a huge step. So I don't know about the rest of you, but when I was first becoming a professional and working in the corporate space or the organizational space, what I would hear a lot of is that when you come to work, you check or keep your personal life outside of work. And when you get to work, you're only supposed to be focused on your professional duties and responsibilities, your project, your deadlines, your deliverables, but you weren't allowed to bring your full self there. So I think, first of all, just signaling to people that it's okay to talk about their experiences and providing that space goes a long way to helping to rewrite that narrative that people cannot bring their cultural sensibilities to work, because of course we know that in many cases, those who are privileged can, and those of us who may come from underrepresented groups often feel like we cannot bring ourselves to work. So I would say that. Issuing statements, so if you're a leader, issuing a statement, sending out notifications or a letter to your staff to say, we recognize that this event has taken place. We're here to offer support. We're here to be there for you. That goes a long way to letting people know that they're being seen and that you're trying and that you're showing some courage. And so those are things that you can do immediately. What are some other things you can do? You can perhaps talk about, or if you haven't already created an affinity group or an employee group for people of different backgrounds, you can start to do that. You can look at social policies. How are you helping to support social justice causes and initiatives? Perhaps you may appoint people to a DEI committee. Perhaps you're going to look at your recruitment and retention strategy. So there are a number of things that you can do that don't cost money, that don't take a lot of time, that you can start right now. Why is that important? Because it helps to build credibility. People will see that you're starting, you're trying, you may not be perfect, but at least you're putting yourself out there to say, we care about our employees and we want everyone to feel included. That then gives you extra cachet to do other things. And yes, at some point, as Maria said earlier, no one is going to be perfect. I would even say to you, even as long as I've been in this field, there are mistakes and things that I may forget, I may neglect. I think it's important to recognize that. But if you have done work and you've shown some commitment, then people will be more forgiving if they know that you're trying and it's a good faith effort, as opposed to a situation where there's nothing being done, there's silence, or there's what we call analysis paralysis, where you're too busy trying to research and think of the best thing to do, which leads to inaction, and that can speak volumes as well. So it's important that you try to do something, think about it, take your time, but also ask the people who are going to be impacted. You don't have to come to these solutions on your own. That's why you have people within your organization. And I've been surprised that sometimes. I have a quick story. I have a client that's based in Western Europe, and they had some, let's just say, some issues with diversity, equity, and inclusion around marketing. And what we found out when we did the research and audit was that they never leveraged the cultural expertise of the people within the organization who belonged to the group that was affected. They never talked to people of color. They never talked to Black people. Had they simply done that, they could have avoided what I call some of these cultural faux pas that they created, or some of these mistakes. And so leverage the people there with you, and they will tell you what you can do, what you should do, and what you should not do. And those are ways that you can at least begin the process and take those first steps towards a larger goal of inclusion.
If I could add to that and just build a little, I think Joel has come up with some really powerful examples, but there are also some very, very simple ones like, and I think we might have mentioned this yesterday, since we're having employee-led groups and like-minded groups have discussions, they will probably come up with ideas for simple, quick wins themselves, just in terms of the language we're using in the publications in the organization, or in the information circulars we send out. Is the language clear? Are there other things that they identify that would be, again, quick wins and simple things to fix that make people of color, Black people, feel more comfortable, for example? The other thing is, I've been so struck recently for my own education too, by all of the YouTube videos, recent TED Talks, interviews that have been very powerful on the issue of racism. So again, there are so many out there, but maybe to suggest a couple of particularly interesting and informative ones that some centers might like to use it for brown bag lunch discussions. You know, show a 20-minute video or interview, have a discussion, invite everybody, but have someone facilitate the discussion. I mean, that's a quick and simple thing to do if it's well chosen and people get used to the language, to the discussion, and to speaking up. Just a couple of ideas for quick things to do to increase awareness and raise the comfort level, maybe.
Fantastic, thank you.
Thanks very much, Joel and Maria. One of the things that I do want to highlight is that, you know, the point that both Joel and Maria have made today, and also Nini also highlighted yesterday, the importance of, you know, taking the step, you know, first to do a little bit of reading, get a little bit self-informed. If this is not something that has been part of your life, that you get, you know, you take the responsibility to educate yourself a little bit, so that you can, you know, you can take the action that's needed to make a difference in your workplace. But also, if you're a supervisor, a manager, a people leader, take a look at the toolkit, the inclusion toolkit that will be coming out next week. There's a couple of workbooks in there specifically designed for you as a manager or a supervisor to do what Maria has just suggested, you know, to take those brown bag lunches, to take half an hour at the start of a staff meeting, and we've got some questions, some suggested speaking points, you know, to help guide you as a manager through to navigate some of those discussions. So take a look at some of those workbooks, see if they're going to be useful to you, and don't hesitate to reach back out to us if you'd like to chat about any of those resources that we're giving to you. Now, I can see that that there has been...
I'm getting lots of questions now, some really good ones coming through.
Great.
Yeah, so this is good. Thank you, everybody. You're all warming up. This is great. So one that has been sent to me is, how do centers create safe spaces for conversations on race and racial discrimination without being told that white people face that too?
Well,
So,
I think, well, I'll take
Joel,
that
great, thank
part.
you.
So Maria and I are going to tag team, because I know that we both have something to say here. When we talk about privilege, because that's what you're really talking about by that question, and thank you for answering that question. What we're really talking about is privilege. And here's what we need to understand about privilege. Okay, and what we say when we talk about privilege are those advantages that are accorded to people by virtue of their membership to a particular group. Okay, and so when we talk about privilege, we're in no way suggesting that people have not had to deal with hardship. What privilege suggests is that you haven't had to deal with the things that I have had to based on blank. So for example, if we're talking in the context of people of color, Black people, it's systemically, it is pretty well documented that there are things that the majority of white people have not had to deal with by virtue of being white. The numbers, whether we're talking about job discrimination, lack of educational opportunities, even if we're talking about something that's outside of the scope of the organizational response, which may be engagements with law enforcement, there's a difference. Now, does that mean that we ignore or dismiss the experiences of white people? Absolutely not. What it means, though, however, is that we understand that by virtue of being white, you do not have to deal with certain things. Just like, for example, by me identifying as a man, I don't have to deal with things that women have to deal with. And I think we have to understand that. And so too many times when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it is framed as an either or. So that by giving attention to one group, we are thereby, it's suggested that we're somehow taken away from another group. And that's not what it is. It's also, I think, an opportunity to discuss equality and equity. So equality means we treat everybody the same, but we know that not every group and not every person within an organization is going to have the same rights, it's going to have the same opportunities by virtue of their membership to the group and that group's historical experiences. And so if we recognize that equity is about treating people fairly, that means that as a leader, as an organization, you may have to create different apparatus to treat people and to bring people into the conversation and to give people opportunity. It doesn't mean that you're just missing the experiences of those who are white. It means you're recognizing systemic racism. And it's important to be clear about that. And it's important to, and I was going to talk about this and I'll wait until later. One of the things I want to get into is white fragility, because what's coming up there as well is this idea that when we talk about racism, because the needs and the sensibilities of white people have not been centered, then all of a sudden there's defensiveness, there's anxiety, and there's angst that people are asked to focus on, which then obscures the needs and the requests of people of color. And so what happens with white fragility is that when I or another person of color has something they want to talk about, we become less focused on what my needs might be and more concerned about the reaction of the white person who does not want to deal with their privilege, who doesn't understand equity, and feels that somehow there's a zero-sum game because you're talking about my needs as opposed to focusing exclusively on theirs. And those things have to be addressed in order for the organization to have a really proper response to people of color and not to get distracted and by these conversations that somehow focusing on anti-racism means that somehow you're ignoring white people. Those are some really key things to focus on and to think about and to recognize and to reaffirm to white people that you're not separate from the discussion, but from an equity standpoint, there are different things that you have to do to bring people of color in and Black people in particular.
Maria, do you want to add to that?
I think Joel's done a great job. The only thing I would say is that inherent in what he was saying was we have to practice listening and curiosity rather than emotion and embarrassment or feeling defensive. You know, we all need to listen better and to really be curious, you know, in a non-judgmental way. Just be curious, ask. How did you feel about that? Or why do you think that happened? You know, from a place of non-judgment.
Okay, great. So this is again another, sorry.
I just, you know, just to follow up on that before we move on, Helen, I mean, one of the, I'm really glad that you brought up white fragility. I feel very strongly about it, Joel and Maria, and I think this is something that, you know, certain parts of our workforce, you know, we can really make a difference in terms of becoming allies. You know, would you like, you know, the word allyship pops up quite a lot in the discourse. You know, can you help people who are online understand, you know, what is allyship and how can members of our workforce become allies for other people?
Maria, did you want to take that?
You go for that, Joel.
Allyship requires advocacy. It is leveraging your social, cultural, political capital to support those who are underrepresented. So it's not simply saying, as has become popular, I'm an ally. It's not posting on social media. It means that you must lend your support in a tangible way to help affect equitable outcomes for underrepresented groups. And is really a key thing. So what does that look like? First of all, I would say examining your own bias. We all have it. I hope that's not controversial. Doing your own education. And so understanding the different journeys and stories and narratives of different groups around the globe. It means having discussions with people in your network. It means avoiding fragility. So being able to maintain and to center the needs of the underrepresented group during the conversation. It also means advocacy, as we talked about. And it means also allowing people to, making space for people to share their experiences and to show up on their own authentic cultural terms, not the terms that feel comfortable for you. That's something that you can do individually, and that's something that I think you have to push the organizations to do collectively if you want to be a good ally. And I would also say to those of you here on the call, allyship is not something that you get to designate yourself as being. The people in the affected group will tell you when they feel like you're being a good ally, but it's not something where you do a couple of things and then you say, okay, I've got the certificate, I'm a good ally now. That's not how it works. But it has to be approached from a level of cultural humility to really make sure that you're supporting the needs of underrepresented people and not just doing it for ego-based reasons or self-aggrandizement.
Mhm.
If I may, I would just add one thing to that, which is, I think in order also to be an ally, I think it's important for all of us to remember that racism is a multifaceted and multi-dynamic issue. And in an organization like this, where you have people of color, Black people from different experiences, different parts of the world, their experience of racism is going to be different. For example, for me, as someone brought up in England, raised by Caribbean parents, my experience and having worked in different organizations is going to be different from a Black person from another part of the world and with a different experience. So let's not think that because we've heard a story from one group that we've now got it all and we've understood it. It's very complex and dynamic. And I think we also, as Black people, need to listen to experiences of other Black people because we don't know it all either. We haven't experienced it all.
Thanks very much. Back to you, Helen.
Yes, so question here is, feeling that in my organization, racism is not overt, but shown sort of subtly by less stretching goals for people of color, fewer ad hoc opportunities to take responsibility. So reducing their visibility and the chances for them to shine. How do you tackle that kind of subtle discrimination? Maria, do you want to try that one first?
Sure. Well, one thing, of course, is I think the courage and creating the opportunity perhaps to have discussions with colleagues, managers about your goals and about your potential and the things you'd like to try. So in other words, try to create a space where you can push that envelope a little bit for the things you'd like to achieve. I'm not saying that's an easy discussion, but I think performance discussions and work discussions are difficult. And if there is an element of racism in it, it's going to be even more so. But I would encourage at least you, if this hasn't taken place already, to have some frank discussions about what you feel your potential is and things you'd like to actually try to demonstrate it as a first step. I don't know if Joel wants to add to that, but in this context, in this environment that we work in, it's a difficult one. I would also solicit advice from other colleagues and peers who could maybe give you more advice, knowing the specific context. Others who might actually somehow help to give you other opportunities to join, I don't know, project groups or to contribute to someone else's project that can show that you can do it and you have the capacity to do it. Joel?
I think there's an element to this question as well of, if it's not impacting me, but I'm witnessing it within the organization as a bystander, is there anything that somebody can do as well if they're seeing it happening to others? And it's very subtle, it's not overt.
Well, again, I would say, is there advice that you can give to the persons or people you see about? Again, I think demonstrating, joining project teams or having someone actually thank them or expose something that they've achieved or the potential so that they don't feel isolated. These people that you're speaking of must be very isolated. So how can we become, as Joel was saying, actually an ally to that person in advising or even stepping in to promote them, and be in a positive way a sponsor for them, if that's possible. Joel, you want to add to that?
This kind of ties into a question that was posted in the chat where a person was saying that, you know, they witnessed and felt there was some racism taking place within their particular team or group, but they were afraid to bring it up because their supervisors were part of the group receiving the feedback. So, you know, this goes back into allyship. Is there someone within the organization who you can go to, who you trust, who can have that conversation and bring up that topic? Is there a way to create an anonymous system of feedback as well, so that you can bring up issues and you can do so without there being any attribution? I think also, if you feel so empowered to have conversations with people one-on-one, I'm very much a fan of, I'm going to use an American euphemism, so I apologize if it's not familiar to the rest of you, calling people in as opposed to calling them out. So what do I mean by that? At least here, when people say they're going to call you out, it means that they're going to a person who's a perpetrator or a person who's doing something that is engaging in exclusive behavior. They can do it in a way where it brings embarrassment or shame to the person who may be engaging in certain exclusive behavior. And it's important to recognize that within that triangle between the bystander, the witness or the target, and the perpetrator, that everybody is being impacted, okay? Everybody just plays a different role. And so we certainly want to take care of the person who's being targeted and make sure they're safe, but there's also a chance to rehabilitate the person who may be unaware of their actions, because of course, sometimes people have positive intent, they don't recognize their impact. And so if you call them in, which is an invitation for them to be more curious, to build more connection, to learn differently, and just to build that awareness, there's also an opportunity to help that person to understand what they did that may not have created inclusion, and how they can show up differently, so that everybody uses this as a learning opportunity. And so if you're in a situation where you're feeling that you can't speak up, then I would encourage you to do research, maybe to find out what's the best way to bring something up, to create an anonymous system, if you can, make it that general suggestion where people can submit feedback anonymously, or to talk to other people within the organization, allies of yours, who might be able to bring up the conversation on your behalf, so that you can get your concerns addressed.
Mm. And just building on that, I think yesterday we touched on this, you know, if there are groups in the organization with a specific, even if it's informal, but with the concern for gender, for example, why don't we have groups that are particularly concerned with race and racism and anti-racism in the organization, who people could specifically go to, focal points, for example. And again, that's a difficult one, because, you know, choosing a focal point in and of itself for this is always wrought with possible mistakes and so on. But if you have someone you can go to speak to, has that responsibility to informally coach or help you, that would be a great help, I think, for many people.
Okay, thank you. A question here, which is based on personal experience, is how do you deal with the covert insinuations that you've achieved what you have because of your color and gender and not because you're capable? Is this, the person asking, is it just something that they should ignore and pretend not to have noticed the slight, or should they address?
Well, I'm smiling because I've heard this so often, both in my, and I've dealt with this, I'm sure Maria has as well, in my personal experience, and I've also seen that with friends. It depends on your personal comfort level. And I would say to you, what is the goal? That's the important thing. What is the goal? Is the goal because you want to maintain a relationship, and you know that you're going to be working with this person for a long period of time, intimately? Do you believe that your job performance is going to be impacted by that? Is this person who has no relationship to you or your job? Is it about simply releasing some stress and the negative energy? Because there's also a need for that too, because there's so many microaggressions and micro insults that people of color and Black people get on a day-to-day basis. And as Black people and as people of color, sometimes the expectation is that we should just always swallow, suppress, and repress how we feel. And I don't think that's healthy from a holistic standpoint. And so obviously being professional, if your goal is just to release stress, I think there's an opportunity to turn the question around and to say to someone, why do you feel that? Because really, when they make those comments, it's not about you, it's about them. And so you could easily say, tell me more about why you said that, and why did you feel it's necessary to share that, and where does that come from? If you so choose, I would tell you that for me, it depends on the day. Most times I've gotten to a point where I don't let it affect me, I don't bother me, but I also don't carry the energy. I don't carry it with me. I give it back to the other person, but I do it respectfully and say, you know, maybe there's a reason why you brought it up, but this is how it impacted me. And if you have any questions about, you know, what's the word I'm looking for, my credentials or my background or whatnot, you know, that's not really for me to answer here. And I would ask you to think more about why you felt the need to question or to answer that. But it depends on what your goal is. And I would say that for many of us, we wouldn't have gotten where we are if we had not had to endure that. That doesn't mean that you should take it, but you have to think about what's your goal and what do you need the moment. And sometimes if I wouldn't go into a situation expecting to necessarily change the person, but you can certainly change the dynamic, because in that situation, that person perhaps made that comment because they're trying to intimidate, they're trying to negatively impact. And I think you can turn that power dynamic around and remind them that ask them why they asked that question, and remind them that you are capable, you've done the work, you are in that position for a reason, and make them think more about why they chose to ask that question or to engage in those microaggressions that they did. Maria, what's your experience with that? I'm just curious.
I guess my key message from my own experience is, do not let this undermine your confidence, because a lot of this can eat away at your confidence. And again, it's almost like gaslighting, you know, if they keep telling you, you'll start to believe it, you know, that you are going crazy and that you are only there because you happen to be a Black person or a woman or whatever it is. So I would say, in addition to what Joel has said, consciously realize that you have to stand your ground on this one, be firm, be confident. And I really like a lot of things that Joel said. What would make you say that? I wonder what your intention is of mentioning this, you know. On the other hand, I think there's also a time where if you cannot confront it or manage it at the moment, I would say go away, reflect on it, because you can always come back and say, you know, you said yesterday, or there was an exchange yesterday which really had an impact on me, or which I need to say was insulting or whatever. So you don't have to do it all at once. And we often know that in hindsight, we wish we'd said something else or whatever. So if it's tough, take that breath and maybe go away and work on it until the next day if necessary.
Thank you. So I think we've probably got time for one last question, and we're slowly running out of time. Have I got time for one last one, Fiona?
Yes, one last one.
So, okay, I'm gonna read this as it's written. It says, my question was a lot longer, but I deleted most of it because I couldn't figure out how to frame it. So, is people of color the term to use? White is also a color. How would racism between people of color be termed?
Can you repeat that last part again, Helen? I'm sorry.
How would racism between people of color be termed?
Interesting.
Well, if I may, let me just jump in and say racism between people of color. We actually touched on this yesterday to some extent because, you know, in different parts of the world, and again, from my Caribbean heritage, we have colorism, right? Which in and of itself is racist. If you, and this is a colonial hangover as well, where lighter people who are brown or lighter Black may be seen as privileged, or held in higher esteem than those who are darker because of the whole racial racial mix within the Caribbean, for example. And I'm sure Joel will say this happens in the US too, but I've had experiences where I've talked about being black and people have said to me, but you're not black, you're brown, So there is racism within people of color, and I think we call it. That's for me, you simply call it because it's perpetuating something very, very unhealthy within us as well. So I wouldn't let us as people of color off the hook for not calling out racism within us, for example. But Joel, I hand over to you.
Yeah, there's so much there that we don't have time to talk about, but what I would say is racism is a multifaceted phenomenon. And so, yes, you can have racism between groups. I think what we have to understand, though, at least as I've experienced it here in the United States, is all the racism that you see, though, is, however, primarily, I've seen it as an extension of white supremacy, because the way it's manifest here in the United States, when you do see racism, is all about power and positionality and who can be deemed more favorable to those who are in power. Is it a problem? Yes. In terms of the phrase people of color, is not exactly precise. And I understand what the person is saying, that white is in of itself a color, but the way that we have been racialized here in the States and North America, white people have not been seen as being cultural. White people have not been seen as being ethnic. That's not true. But anything that's deviated from quote unquote the norm is being seen as being exotic, really cultural, really ethnic. So that's why the term of people of color originated, because we were seen as being completely different than the standard of the norm, which we know is not true, but it's based on, a lot of times these phrases are not exactly the most precise, because we live in a society that's had a very clumsy relationship in talking about difference in race and color. But that is a term that has been used as an umbrella term to incorporate anybody who is non-white. And some people don't like that term. Is really something where if you're talking to a person, ask them, is it okay to refer to you as a member or as a person of color, or do you prefer to be called Black, or do you prefer to be called Indigenous or First Nation or Native American or Asian or Latinx? It's going to be a matter of personal preference. And so with all things intercultural, always ask the individual, what's their preference? What do they want to be? How they want to be referenced? That's always a good starting point.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really important question. When we had Nini with us yesterday, she was giving a very clear perspective, from an African continent perspective, and especially from a sub-Saharan African and South African perspective. The importance of language and how historical legacy has basically added additional challenges, additional layers, onto the choice of language. And really, I think a really interesting conversation yesterday around, which concluded pretty much what Joel said, which is there's really no substitute for just asking people, just asking people what their preference is, Now, I hate to do this to us. It's hard to believe it, but we've run out of time. Today, we started some courageous conversations. We took the opportunity to hear what we can do to combat racism in our global workplaces. Thank you so much to Maria and Joel for the great insights, and thanks for the opportunity for me to share just a little bit about what's happening in the GDI function. As we wrap up, you'll see on the right-hand side, there's a little link which Helen has put up to allow you to please share your feedback using the survey link. Your feedback is so important to us because it helps us get better every time we do this. If you would like to hear what Nini had to say on this subject, both of these recordings will be available up on the GDI webpage, and so you can go and hear what you missed from yesterday. A big thank you once again to Joel and Maria. You've given us a lot of food for thought. It was great, even more today than we had yesterday. Really good. Thank you so much, very much appreciated. Thanks very much to Helen for taking care of the chat line once again and making sure we had all the voices. And a very, very special thank you to all of you who joined us today. It was lovely to have a much smaller, more intimate group so we could hear more voices. I hope you found the sessions useful. You can keep up to date with all GDI happenings through our webpage, which can be accessed through cgiar.org, and you can sign up for the regular GDI guides. If you don't want to do any of that, you can always drop me an email on f.farrell@cgiar.org. It'd be great to hear from you. Until then, take care, stay safe, talk soon. Thank you, goodbye.